Hi there, my name is Bruno-Maria and I'm a photographer. Did you watch the video Lesbos in 2016? If you didn't, I suggest you go and watch it first before you watch this video. And if you did, I hope you enjoyed what you saw. I have a passion for taking such pictures. But even more so, I have a passion for teaching people how to take such pictures, because I am convinced that anyone can learn this. In fact, I had many students who were besides themselves with excitement once they experienced what they could do with what I taught them. In this video, I want to share some of the secrets behind the pictures you just saw. And I will also tell you something about how my photography courses work. No matter whether you are a total novice, have some experience, or are already very clued up, you stand to learn a lot from what I'm about to share with you. Now, the single most important reason why pictures often turn out disappointing is the fact that what your camera sees and what you see are two very different things. And if we understand what the differences are, then we can take beautiful pictures in almost any situation. Now, I want to start with the most frequent one, why pictures sometimes turn out disappointing. Think back to your last holiday. You were in a beautiful location, and I'm sure you had moments where you said, "Oh gosh, the light is so beautiful, I must take a picture of this." And then you tried to take a picture of it, but the picture did not capture at all what was so exciting to you. Even if you played around with different settings, it didn't come out right. Ever experienced that? Why is that? Now here is why. The dynamic range your eyes can see is much, much bigger than the dynamic range your camera can see. What is dynamic range? Very simple. Dynamic range is the difference between the darkest areas in which you can still see detail and the brightest areas in which you can still see detail. You see, your eyes are much, much better at this than the camera is. Now, the camera can either expose the bright areas correctly, and then the dark areas will look totally boring and uninteresting, or it can expose the dark areas correctly, and then the bright areas will be what we call in photography burnt out. Totally uninteresting, like a hole in the picture. Did any one of you ever take pictures of flowers? Many people like to take pictures of flowers. Now look at your pictures. Are there any pictures in which you see white spots in the flowers? Even though the flowers are red, blue, or whatever color, why do they have white spots? The reason why there are white spots in the flowers is that these areas are totally overexposed. I can explain it in a much more in-depth technical way, but basically what happens is the areas that are overexposed turn white. This is the gist of the problem and what you need to know for now. Which doesn't mean that any picture that lies outside of the dynamic range of the camera should be boring or a failure. In fact, I can show you one of those pictures. Let's have a look. Now, in this picture, the sun is overexposed. In reality, the sun looked red. it isn't overexposed by that much that the sun turned white, but it did change the color in that direction, so it became yellow, which is still acceptable, because when the sun is higher in the sky, it does appear yellow. Now look at the other end of the spectrum. Look at the fishermen. When I took that picture, I could clearly see what color their clothes were, but the camera can no longer see that, because it exceeds the lower end of the dynamic range. It just shows up as black, which in this picture is actually an asset, because they show up as a very gripping graphic element, as if they were two-dimensional and cut out of black paper. The result is a picture that makes you go, wow. So that was difference number one between what the camera sees and what you see. And in my opinion, the limited dynamic range is the single most important reason why people are not able to capture these magical moments on holiday. Difference number two, in my opinion, is angle of view. And I want to say, with angle of view, I don't mean the point from which the camera takes the picture. What I mean is how wide or narrow the view is one sees through the lens. If you have a camera with a zoom lens, then you can change the focal length. What is focal length? Focal length in optical systems means the distance between the middle of the lens and the sensor when focused on infinity. Now, our eyes always have the same focal length, but in cameras we can change the focal length, especially if we're working with a system camera where we have interchangeable lenses. Now, what does this do to the picture? Let's take the most obvious example of this, the telelens. Telelenses, or telezooms, are lenses with long focal lengths and a narrow angle of view. And we always see them at sports events, where you see professionals shoot with these monstrous lenses. And what they actually shoot is close-up of athletes in action, even though they themselves are standing at the sidelines. In this video of Lesbos, I shot some pictures with long telelenses. Let me find one for you. Here I have some people paddling. This was taken with a 300mm lens, which is a long telephoto lens. The people look sharp, but the water around them is already quite blurred. And the effect of that is that the people really stand out. You cannot look anywhere else. So the way this comes across in the picture mimics the way we see it when we look at it in real life. The moment our eyes focus on the people, everything else appears blurred, just like it is in this picture. This characteristic of telelenses can make pictures look really dramatic. But the same is true at the other end of the spectrum. With super wide-angle lenses, we can also make very dramatic looking pictures because of the extreme wide angle of view. Many beginning photographers might think that we use super wide angles to make sure you can get everything into the picture, but that is only a tiny aspect. One of the reasons why we use these lenses is it makes stunning, dramatic images. And one way they do that is they exaggerate the perspective. What does that mean? Whatever is close to the lens appears much bigger on the picture than what we see. And what is further away from the lens appears much smaller than what we see. So the picture gets a lot of depth. Let me show you some examples of this. Have a look at this poppy field. It looks like it goes on forever. And that is exactly what makes this picture. Here is another one. Here there was absolutely nothing spectacular to see. But what makes this picture is the weather was turning bad, and through the low camera point and the use of an extreme wide-angle lens, this catchy image came about. I'm sure that most of you have been misled at least once by a super wide-angle picture. Did you ever choose a certain holiday hotel because in the catalog the pool looked absolutely huge, and then when you got there you were surprised how small it actually was? Well, now you know why. So wide-angle lenses will exaggerate the perspective. The picture will have much more depth than what we see. Telephoto lenses will compress the perspective, and things that are behind each other will appear to be much closer to each other than they are in reality. And that is actually the perspective we always see when we are watching a bicycle race. There's one guy ahead and it looks like the guys behind him are already catching him, where in fact it's not the case. We also have a very sort of practical application of this principle in everyday life when we drive our car. Did it ever happen to you that you looked in your outside mirror and started to overtake, and then you had the guy behind you hoot? Why is that? The outside mirror, for safety reasons, has a wide angle effect so that the dead angle is reduced and things actually appear much further away than they are in reality or what you see in your rear mirror inside the car. Now, there is one very important difference which wide-angle lenses and telelenses point at between what the camera sees and what we see. You see, our eyes only see sharp in one plane. Camera systems can do this, but they can also do the opposite. It is the nature of optical systems that wide-angle lenses tend to have a lot of things sharp. Telephoto lenses tend to have a narrow plane of focus. Now, in landscape photography, we usually want to have everything sharp. Then why would one ever have a narrow plane of focus? The advantage of that is that you can force people to look at a certain spot in your picture. It gives you that control over it. Let me show you an example of that. Here in this picture there is only one point that is sharp and everything else is more or less blurred. This blurriness actually has a name in photography. It's called bokeh. B-O-K-E-H. Don't ask me why it is spelled like this. And the quality of expensive telephoto lenses is measured not only by their sharpness, but also by the amount of blurriness they can create in the picture. And professionals actually pay great bucks to have lenses that have a focal plane that is as narrow as a razor blade. Now, there is something we can do to influence what we call depth of field in our picture. Depth of field refers to what things in the picture will appear to be sharp. And that is the aperture. When we have a large aperture, which is reflected in a low number, we will have a very shallow depth of field. Only certain things will be sharp. When we have a small aperture, which is reflected in a high aperture number, then many things in our picture will appear sharp. Now there is one other thing we need to realize. When we change the aperture, we will automatically also influence the shutter speed. You see, every picture comes about as a combination of aperture and shutter speed. When we have a large aperture, the shutter speed will be faster. When we have a small aperture, the shutter speed will be slower. We will usually see the influence of the aperture because it will mean that certain things only are sharp or the entire picture is sharp. But in most cases, we will not be able to see the shutter speed unless we get into the extreme ranges, either extremely slow or extremely fast. And the interesting thing is that our eyes can neither see extremely slow shutter speeds nor extremely fast ones. Let me show an example of this. This picture here was shot at 1/5000th of a second, which freezes the motion of the water, so you can see all the tiny little drops in the air. It makes for a spectacular picture. The same principle is applied in this one, by the way. Now, let's look at the opposite, where the shutter speed is really slow. In this picture here, the water in the river is flowing fairly quickly. It was almost dark. The sun had set more than half an hour earlier, so the only way I could get enough light to reach the sensor was by having the shutter open for 2 seconds. And that's what created this blurry, milky effect. Now, this picture was only possible because it was wind still, so the leaves of the tree and the grass look sharp, because there was no movement at all there. And the result is a picture that has quite a magic feel to it, just like the place itself. In this sense, our camera allows us to create images that we cannot see in everyday life. Now, go out and try this yourself. And don't forget to put your camera on a tripod. Professionals actually use special filters to even be able to create this effect in daylight. These filters are called ND filters, which stands for neutral density, because they do not change the colors. All they do is they make the shutter speed slower. Let me find an example where I used an ND filter to create the effect. This picture here was taken in bright daylight, but because I used an ND filter that makes the shutter speed 1,000 times slower, we can see how the water flowed over the rocks, which makes for a stunning effect. Now, how can the camera figure out what aperture needs to go with what shutter speed? It can do that because it has a built-in light meter. And this light meter is pretty smart. It can measure just one spot in the picture, or it can measure mainly the center of the picture and not so much what's around it, or even other method, it can measure 5 different segments in the picture, measure each of these, tally it up, and then average it out to get the correct exposure. Now, how does the camera then decide what is the correct exposure? And here is something very important you need to know. The camera will look at every picture as if it were neutral gray. That's a term in photography. Neutral gray is a certain density. And the camera will use this way of evaluating the picture because in most situations it will actually fit. Because most pictures will consist of something that is very bright and something that is very dark, and when you mix all the bright and dark areas together, it comes out as a density that is similar to neutral gray, so it will actually work. Now, what happens if, for instance, you are on top of a mountain and you take a picture looking down at a dark blue lake, and on this dark blue lake there's a small little white boat. Most of the picture is filled with the dark blue lake. Now the camera will interpret this dark blue as neutral gray. So what will it do? It will actually overexpose the dark blue lake to come out like neutral gray in density. And what will happen to the white boat? It will be completely washed out. It will look like a hole in your picture. Totally uninteresting. The same problem occurs at the other end of the spectrum. Let's say, for instance, you photograph a lady dressed in black sitting in front of a white wall. Most of the picture consists of the white wall, and the camera will interpret the white wall as being neutral gray. So what will it do? It will underexpose the white wall, and the lady who is dressed in black will lose all detail. The picture will be basically boring. Now, how can we get around this? Here is what you need to do. Whenever you take a picture with values that are mainly bright, you have to tell the camera to overexpose the picture. When you take a picture of something that is mainly very dark, then you have to tell the camera to underexpose the picture. And then both will come out the way you saw it. And that brings me to another topic, the histogram. You might not be familiar with this word, but most of you have already been bothered by the histogram. The histogram are these mountains that appear sometimes on your monitor before you take the picture. The histogram is the greatest tool and the greatest invention in digital photography, because with the histogram you can really control the exposure. So what does it tell you? It shows all the different tone values we have in our picture, from the darkest to the brightest. And we actually have 3 histograms because all colors are made up of red, blue and green. So there is one for each color. The left side of the histogram shows the dark tones, the right side shows the bright ones. Now, if your mountain in the histogram does not come back to 0 at the right edge of it, it means that you will have parts of your picture that are so bright that they no longer have any detail in them. That's what we call burnt out. And that is something we don't want at all, because it's just like a hole in our picture. Totally uninteresting. If it hits the left side, then there will be areas that are totally black. Again, without any detail. Now that doesn't always have to be a mistake. It can make the picture look very interesting. Remember our example from before. We know that the fishermen are underexposed because they have no detail anymore, just the outline. Where can we see that in our histogram? Over here. Look at the left side of the histogram, where the mountain hits the left side. And that brings us actually to the next important topic in digital photography, which is called white balance. What is white balance? You see, when we see a banana, we know it's yellow, and we will see it as yellow in many different kinds of light. We will see yellow banana in the sun, in the shade, under certain tungsten light. We will always see a yellow banana in a very, very wide range of tolerance. But our camera is not like that. The range of tolerance for the white balance is much narrower. People who don't know anything about white balance will always photograph in what we call AWB, stands for automatic white balance. Now, the camera can do that automatically, but what is even much more interesting is to set the white balance ourselves. We can use it to obtain the correct colors. If the white balance is correct, a white surface will look white. But if it isn't, a white surface will come out yellow, bluish, or any other color. Now, again, let me show you some pictures where we can see this. In this picture here, the little chapel is white, but it appears quite yellow because the lights illuminating it have quite a low color temperature. Why did I not set the camera to such a low color temperature to make sure that the chapel appeared white? Well, there are two reasons for that. The first one is, if I had done that, I would have lost this little bit of redness on the horizon, as the color temperature in that area is a lot higher than on the chapel. And the second reason why I did this is the fact that the chapel looks yellow, and it makes it look much more pleasant to the eye. There's a very nice contrast between the warm chapel and the deep blue color of the sky. An even more spectacular example of this can be seen in this picture here. The white balance setting on my camera is too high for the tungsten lights that lit the cocktail bar, which is why it appears more yellow than in reality. And it is also too low for the sky, which appears much more blue than it is in reality. There are very complicated ways in which you can look at color temperature, but the basics are very simple. Everyone knows that the light of a conventional light bulb is much warmer than daylight. Everyone has already noticed that when a person stands in the sun, the light is much warmer than when they are standing in the shadow. In the shadow it looks a little bluish. Which is the reason why even the smallest compact camera has different settings for white balance. And you will find different icons. You will find an icon for the sun, you will have a cloud, you will have a little house that is casting a shadow, there will even be a light bulb, many different settings. If we set it appropriately, the way the light is, then the colors will come out right. And if we have light from different sources, as we saw in the pictures just now, then we can create very beautiful effects, provided we know what we are doing. You see, in photography, there is this special time of the day which we call the blue hour. The blue hour is the time where the sun has already set and the light is changing very quickly in a transition to total darkness. The fact that we call it blue hour is actually not entirely correct, because it's much shorter and is just one very short window of time where this blue hour effect is at its best. I can show you an example of this. In this picture, the blue hour was at its peak. I had my white balance adjusted for the tungsten lights that shine on the castle, which is a very warm light with a low Kelvin value for those of you who know what it is. The castle itself looks the color I saw it. But why does the sky look so intense? Because the color temperature of the sky is about 3 times as high as that of the lights that shine on the castle. It is not Photoshop. This is how the picture came out of the camera. An even more interesting example of this principle can be seen in this picture here. First of all, we have the artificial lights on the mountain underneath the church. Then there are the warm lights of the street in the village. And the most interesting thing is the water that reflects the blue sky, which has a very high color temperature and therefore looks very bluish. These are all technical aspects one should know about if one wants to do well in landscape photography. So in my courses I teach all the differences between what you see and what your camera sees, and I've only touched upon it briefly here. And from there you will learn how to set all the knobs on your camera, what they are for and when you use them. And once these things have been understood, then we can look at the more fascinating aspect of photography. Then we start to look at composition. Composition is very important. Composition in photography is what rhythm is to music. No matter what the light looks like, if your composition is no good, the picture will be boring. Everyone can develop an eye for good composition. In fact, every one of us has this intuitive instinct because we feel it when we see a well-composed picture. The only problem is we don't know why it's good, and more importantly, how we can create pictures like that ourselves. The biggest mistake that ruins composition when amateurs take pictures is that they look at something in the picture. What's this guy saying? Now, here's my point. The moment you focus your attention on something that appears in your picture, it appears much bigger in your mind than it actually is in the picture. This is psychology. You can ask professional baseball players or cricket players. When the batsman looks at the ball, he's so focused on the ball that this ball actually looks huge in his mind's eye. And the same thing happens when amateurs take pictures. They take a picture of a bird and they look at the bird, so they think, wow, it's quite exciting. But then when you see the picture, the bird is actually much smaller than what they thought. So here is my advice. Don't look at any particular in the picture, look at the entire picture, and your composition will already take a big leap forward. That's a very important principle. The second thing we have to be aware of in photography, and I don't know how this is in cultures where they write from right to left, but for us in the West and for many countries, we look at a picture from left to right. And you might say, oh yeah, but that's your style. No. This is a general principle. Intuitively, we look through the picture from left to right. Let me demonstrate that to you. Let's do an experiment. Have a look at this picture here. What does this picture show you? A waterfall. Your eyes come in from the left and lock into the waterfall. But let's see what happens when we turn it around. do you notice how the leaves become much more visible in this picture? The eye comes in from the left, gets past the first highlight, which is the waterfall, and then come to rest on the leaves. Let me change it again. Here you focus totally on the waterfall, and here the leaves are more prominent. And that brings me to the third important principle of composition, which I like to call the rule of thirds, which says that the climax of your picture should come about 2/3 into the picture from the left side. Now, there is an important application of this principle also in landscape photography, in the sense that we always try to put the horizon either 1/3 from the bottom or 1/3 from the top, depending on what we want to express in the picture. Now, go and have a look at your old pictures and see how many pictures you shot with the horizon in the middle, which is the most uninteresting place it can be in most cases. There always are exceptions to that rule. The following pictures are all based on the 2/3 rule. See if you can spot this. Now, once we know this rule and we know how to apply it, we will be able to break it, because sometimes we just have to do it. It depends on the picture itself. I'll show you some example. Here the aim of the picture is to create this feeling of vastness, poppy flowers all the way to the horizon. It would have been a mistake not to fill the entire picture with the field here. The challenge in composing good pictures is often met by reducing the number of elements that make up its composition. Good composition grabs one and forces the eye to go through the picture in a certain pattern. Bad composition babbles. It's my favorite word to describe bad composition. You have many different elements in the picture and you don't know where to look. That's when I say the picture babbles. So as you learn to put all this into practice, the technical aspects and the composition, you will go through different stages in your photography. The first stage is you're happy when everything more or less looks the way you saw it. The second stage is a very beautiful one. That's the stage where you are already so attuned into what makes the picture work that you can shoot the composition perfectly and you don't have to do any additional cropping afterwards. That is the moment where you pass from being a snap shooter to becoming a photographer. When I work on landscape, it is not my aim to show what things look like. What I try to do in the picture is basically to let people feel the sensation I felt when I saw what is depicted there. To transport the emotion that was there. This aha moment in the picture. Remember the situation I described at the beginning of this video, where there were beautiful moments in nature which you couldn't capture. Well, at some stage in your photography you will come to the opposite of that, where there will be nothing particular to see in a certain situation, but because of your understanding of the technical process and because of your imagination, you will be able to turn these moments into magical pictures. Let me show you where I did that. this picture falls in that category. This picture was actually taken on the first evening of a one-week photo course. I had taught my students about the blue hour earlier that day. The light was gone already. It was almost completely dark, and my students had packed their gear thinking that was it for the day. Now, what makes this picture work is that there was a beach restaurant behind me, and they had some lights that very dimly lit up the rocks. One could hardly see it. So when they turned off the lights, I ran up to them and pleaded with them to leave them on for another 10 minutes, which they did. And it was then that I took this 30-second exposure. This place is facing west, where the sun had set earlier, and there was just this thin sliver of redness left above the horizon. The sea was very calm, so with a 30-second exposure, it became completely flat. As I said, nothing to see anymore, but the image that results from this is just magic. Now that you understand a bit how I introduce people to photography, you might be asking yourself, who are these courses for? Could I benefit from this? These courses are addressed to anyone who gets great pleasure out of taking better pictures and takes them with a digital camera. It doesn't matter what type of digital camera. It can be even the smallest compact camera. In fact, in the Lesbos video, 2 pictures were taken with such a camera. Let me find them for you. Here, this picture and this picture were taken with a $200 small little compact camera. So from the smallest compact to the biggest full-frame professional camera, everyone is welcome. No prior knowledge is required, but if you already have some experience, you stand to benefit even more. On the first day, I will explain the differences between what we see and what the camera sees. And from there, you will learn how to use every dial and knob on your camera. You see, every manual tells you what you can set on the camera, but never when you need it or why you should set that. So we will understand all of these aspects. And then I will explain about composition in the way I did here, with more detail. And then we go out and the big adventure starts, where we put everything into practice. Nowadays, I don't take my own cameras, because all I do when we go out is assist you as a participant how to take better pictures. Every day we will go through several assignments, sometimes within walking distance from the hotel, but sometimes we will travel the island, which is about half the size of Mallorca, in rented vehicles and shoot many different things. I know the island very well, basically like the back of my hand, because over a period of 7 years I shot 4 calendars. So I know what there is to shoot, when, and where the interesting spots are, and that in itself is already very worthwhile. Each day we will come back with our pictures and we will upload the best pictures of each one, and then we will together discuss the quality of each picture, and I will show you how to digitally process these pictures in a justified way to enhance them. Because in digital photography, processing is as important as shooting. You want to see an example of that? Well, let's just look back at the last picture I showed you. Now this picture was shot, as you know, with a little compact camera, On a very stormy day, the weather was very heavy and the light was very dramatic at times, with sun and dark clouds all in one picture. Does this picture look unnatural? No, it just has a lot of drama. Now let me show you what it looked like when it came out of the camera. Here it is. Can you see why I say processing is as important as shooting? Would you have kept the picture as it came out of the camera? Probably not. We will not only do scenic and landscape photography. In every course, we spend an entire morning or afternoon working on portrait photography. Everything we learned will also be applied here. And then there are all the things that make portrait photography so fascinating. There is the angle from which to shoot a certain face. There is the lens, the choice of lens we have to use to take a certain portrait. There are all the aspects of what face needs what kind of setup. How can we enhance what we want and reduce what we don't want? And then there's this critical factor of where do we focus on when we take a portrait. And the most interesting aspect of portrait photography is once we get all these things set up, the light is controlled, we have whatever background we need, then it boils down to that ultimate skill of catching the moment. In landscape photography, I always try to bring across the emotion. What does it feel to be there? What does it feel like when we're on location? In portrait photography, I always try to catch the essence of the person. I use that particular moment to capture the beauty, the character, or the soul of a person. It's really fascinating. And actually it only boils down to a simple click. But it takes a lot of experience and a lot of awareness to be able to make that click. So here we will get a very interesting session where everyone will be able to get hands-on experience behind the camera and also in front of the camera. So that basically sort of sums it up what happens in a one-week photography course. Will you be a master after a week? No, I can tell you that. But what I can also tell you is that you will have shot pictures of which you will say, wow, did I do that? You will be really amazed of what results you can achieve. You will learn about all the technical aspects, understand how they work and what it means for the settings on your camera. You will no longer struggle with your camera. You'll be able to set all the dials and know how to use them. You will be able to compose pictures in a much more conscious way, and you will have raised your awareness. And that is basically what it's all about. This intensive way of looking at things and really perceiving things. And that's something that will be very, very useful on every holiday you will ever take thereafter, whether you are taking pictures or not. So after the course, you will basically have the tools to progress further and develop your own skills, no matter what photography you are actually interested in. At the end of the day, it all boils down to consciousness. You see, cameras don't take pictures. People do. Will you be the next one?